The level of, multi drug resistant organisms is something we're all kind of running into. They're not too unaware of that situation, but it's more just us having that communication of like, okay, this is where we're coming from. This is why we're doing this.
Infection stops where information starts. Welcome to the Transmission Control Podcast, where knowledge is your strongest defense. Broadcasting from the front lines of healthcare, we dive into the strategies, science, and stories shaping infection prevention today. Each episode, we connect you with experts on real-world insights to help you stop the spread of healthcare-associated infections, protect patients, and strengthen your practices as an infection prevention and public health expert. When the right information reaches the right people, lives are saved.
Hello and welcome. My name is Garrett, Hollembeak, Editor-in-Chief of Transmission Control, and this is Season 3 of the podcast, The Victory Lap. We're talking about IPs on how they changed the game and mitigated risk to patients. Today we're talking with Blake Thomas about point prevalence testing for Candida auris. Stay tuned and we'll be right back after a brief word from our sponsors.
Brought to you from the studios of Healthcare HQ, let's get into it. This is Transmission Control.
Hello and welcome back to Transmission Control, and this is Season 3, talking about the victory laps that infection preventionists are experiencing out there. Today we've got a great episode with Blake Thomas, and we're joined today by Jill Holdsworth. Jill, how are you today?
I am doing amazing. How are you doing, Garrett?
I'm good, and I'm thankfully not traveling as much as you are. I saw a neat picture of you and Dave Jagrosi on a plane today, so that's always a good IPs out in the wild.
How funny is it that not only am I on the same plane as Dave Jagrosi, but in the same row? That was one fun flight, especially for everybody else.
Yep, I believe it. So today we are talking about a topic that any IP that has had to swab underarms and groins this year is going to be familiar with, and that is point prevalence testing for Candida auris. And when we talked with our guest that made this such a good episode, is that my very first week in IP, we had at one of our associated hospitals, a little, kind of cluster pop up. And so that was like my introduction, week 1 to IP. It's going around asking people about swabbing. So without any further ado, we want to introduce our guest, Blake Thomas. Blake, how are you doing today?
Good, Garrett. Thank you guys too for having me on today. My name is Blake Thomas. My background is in public health. I have my master's in public health and had a chance to work in infection control as well as infection prevention over the last 3 years in different acute care settings, long-term settings, as well as different aggregate settings.
Love seeing another IP who has come through a non-traditional, non-nursing background. Not to say that nurses aren't great. We need them on our teams too, but Garrett and I are both IPs that came from the non-traditional, non-clinical background. So welcome to the club, Blake. Glad to have you.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be a part of the club.
It's a good club to be in. So as we talk about our victory lap that you got to participate in, Blake, let's talk about the need that came up. Was there a cluster, an outbreak? Were we just noticing a higher incidence of Candida auris in your facilities? What was the need that prompted this initiative?
Yeah, definitely. Amazing question. So here in Arizona, we do a lot of things tied to with Maricopa County health departments. So a lot of times if we do have a higher tier 3 organism, which Candida auris is, we'll need to make sure that we're doing a lot of point prevalence surveys. Doing a lot of testing allows us to kind of control any outbreak that might possibly happen within each of the hospitals And Banner's policy is one that's laid out very thoroughly when it comes to making sure if there is a possibility of a patient not being on isolation during a duration of time, then we're going to make sure we can contain that possibility of a Candida auris spread being within a PCU unit, ICU floor, or any behavioral floors when it comes to that.
So Blake, when you mentioned those floors, are those the patients that you were primarily testing on admission, or were you testing all patients on admission?
Yeah, so for our testing on admission, it all fits a criteria for when a patient has either been in a long-term care facility, if they have been on isolation for 72 hours and been actually in contact with a positive Candida auris patient before coming in. Just some people that might fall through the cracks. So Banner has done an amazing job at making sure that we have a great system where we can see if there needs to be a screening of patients. We can kind of just go through different charts to kind of just identify these patients, first and foremostly, or if they're not able to be screened properly through the first admission, we are making sure that we're going through our isolation charts and understanding, okay, this is certain things that we're seeing that's flagged on the charts that either us, infectious disease doctors, hospitalists, as well as other care teams may not be seeing. So it's a lot of different angles that we're trying to attack this and try to understand that we want to make sure that we're containing this tier 3 organism monster as best as we can.
Now, quick follow-up on that, more curiosity for myself. When you identified somebody that you wanted to do surveillance testing on, did you isolate them before the test result came back, or did you isolate them when you identified them as somebody that needed to be tested?
We make sure that we isolate the patient if they're deemed to be a rule out for the Candida auris. And we also, with Candida auris, it being a CPO organism, we make sure that we do a CPO testing as well. So they're going to be on isolation for the duration of when the test is done and when they have been ruled out.
Fantastic. It's a great process.
It really is. I like that you mentioned that kind of slipping through the cracks piece, because you guys weren't just looking at one factor. You were looking at a couple different factors for who to identify that may need testing. Can you tell us a little bit more about the CPO testing that you were involved in and conducted for these patients?
Absolutely. So for our PPS surveillance, when it comes to our infection prevention team here at Banner, it was my kind of first experience doing these more frontline staff infection prevention, infection control kind of just experiences. So what we kind of do is making sure that we're able to, if a patient is deemed to have a positive CPO and positive COR, so they're ruling out, our point prevalence survey is done amongst, containing anybody who is going to be tested within that said floor or pod within Banner. And we're making sure that we're doing the test routinely, as well as getting consensus forms signed and making sure that the labs are well aware that we're doing this test. Thankfully, Arizona being a very kind of just hub for hospitals, Banner has a strong background, a strong kind of team that backs up all of the testing and are able to get the test back, very promptly within a 4 to 5 day period.
Were you doing those tests on site or were you sending them out? It sounded like you were maybe sending them to an outside lab.
Yes, outside lab, as in just not probably the one that we're doing it. Because I've had a chance to work at Banner University Phoenix downtown, as well as Banner Mesa Children's. So when I was working with Banner University Medical Center, we were able to send that said test down because of how large the facility was. It was about 800 to 900 beds. And now once we do our PPS surveillance testing now, we usually just send them from Banner Mesa, Banner Children's over to the BMCP if the test sample size is far too large, and making sure we're able to get it as soon as possible if the patient does rule out, so we can, have just a long list of understanding, okay, we understand who tested positive and who didn't test positive.
This is great. I'm loving this conversation. This is so fun. I have a question. As an IP, I think one of the most frustrating things is when the nursing team seems to not understand the seriousness of some of these organisms. And you see people without their PPE on, not washing their hands. You're not doing even the basic things. And you've got all the signage up, you've got all the things up. So how did you and your team do on-the-fly education or educate ongoing that, hey, we have these organisms? When you see this isolation, it's kind of a big deal.
Absolutely. And that's an amazing question. And as we know, with infection prevention, there's a lot of, barriers when it comes to there being a level of understanding of what exactly the reason is for some of the things that we do. So I think our things are on the fly education is making sure we're obviously referring to policy to the best that we can, be able to, have updated policy that, reflects CDC requirements, as well as, able to disseminate information amongst not only nursing staff, but chief medical officers, our CNOs, chief nursing officers in our labs, are making sure to have their best interest, as well as being able to support us when making sure we're doing these things. And as well with isolation precautions when it comes to, PPE fatigue amongst frontline staff with the nurses, PCAs, and everybody in that whole realm. We just want to make sure, obviously, doing the small things is very important, but, doing the smallest things sometimes is the bare minimum, and having this understanding of when doing these PBS surveys and surveillances is just something we just have to make sure we're able to educate properly and understand that, everybody's angle for what we do is going to be different. So we need all hands on deck and everybody just be on the same page when it comes to situations like this.
It's 100% true, especially with something like Candida auris, because getting that education piece that this is not your garden variety Candida, that it is more resistant to treatment, that it can spread very quickly, and especially in a close patient population like in long-term care. And so when you guys worked with Maricopa County, did you find that your public health background helped you? Because that's sometimes a gap between who you talk to at the county and then how that translates in the hospital. And so did your public health background help you kind of bridge that gap a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm able to be in an amazing team these last 2 facilities I've had a chance to work with the Banner. So I'm not the only person that has a strong public health background. My director has a strong public health background as well as we have an amazing team when it comes to respiratory therapists, PICU nurses, NICU nurses, and being able to have my public health background, it's one of those situations where I don't mind being a soldier amongst generals when it comes to these situations of amazing teams when it comes to infection prevention and infection control. And my public health background within epidemiology has really, allowed me to have a better understanding of exactly what we're approaching when it comes to these Candida auris situations, understanding the fact that multiple drug resistant organisms, are getting stronger as time is going on based upon, antibiograms as well as the different, antibiotics that we are using. So having the understanding, from a foundational level has really helped me to assess situations properly, as well as be able to weed through the trees when it comes to going through these situations when it comes to different patients who might fit the criteria for PBS testing, as well as making sure we're identifying things properly for surveillance.
And I like what you said. I wrote that down. Soldier amongst generals. That's a humble attitude to take and a great attitude, because IPs, sometimes it's getting in there and doing the legwork and kind of doing the less fun job so that we can get a better outcome for our patients. When you talk about buy-in, and so you guys had this, I guess I'll call it a vision to implement a good, robust protocol for point prevalence surveillance. What was the ask process? Who did you have to involve? Who did you have to coordinate? What costs did you maybe have to justify when it came to rolling out this process?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. The buy-in is, the whole hospital essentially, as well as making sure that everybody is well aware that we're doing these point prevalence surveys and surveillance tactics to make sure that we can identify a possible outbreak, as well as, making sure that we're identifying it as soon as possible, whether it be, later on where there might be 15 people within the hospital that test positive for Candida auris versus just 2. So the buy-in essentially is making sure that we're having our labs kind of identified. Our director is making sure that our CNO is well aware, our CMO is well aware, as well as all of the add-ons associated with the floor, frontline staff, charge nurses, lab techs. Obviously, Maricopa County is making sure they're letting us know if there needs to be a point prevalence survey to begin with, and making sure that if there is, a necessity for us to do the test as soon as possible. So making sure that we're setting a time basis to do this point prevalence survey to understand the fact, okay, this is set within our schedule. Everybody's well aware about this. We're getting these consent forms filled out from patients who either can say yes or no to these tests, as well as making sure that all the nurses have the provided e-swabs on the floor to understand that, okay, this is what we are asking you guys to do. We cannot obviously make any of these patients take this, very quote unquote invasive swab, but still making sure that we're able to, do the best that we can with anything that we have available to us, and just being able to collaborate amongst all departments throughout the hospital.
Now, Blake, who was actually doing the swabbing?
The nurses will be doing the swab.
And with that, did you have to do any extra getting the nursing team on board? Did they feel like this was extra work? How did that go over in the beginning?
Great question. I feel like I was able to, when I first got a chance to move here to Arizona and work within Banner in their infection prevention world, this was very novel to me. So having these kind of conversations and communicating with these nurses, on the wide variety of tasks they're already asked to do on a 12-hour shift. So we want to make sure that we are not, adhering to them in a negative way, but making sure that we're, communicating the importance of doing this test. So from my experience personally, I've never had any too much pushback, because we're coming from a place of, okay, we want to make sure that we're able to contain the possibility of this organism spreading throughout the pod and creating even more issue than what we already kind of just have identified from doing the initial PPS testing.
Was IP able to help train or educate the nurses specifically on how to do the swabs, or why we were doing the swabs, or assist in any way to make them feel like you were, helping take some of the burden off of them at all, or just making them feel supported?
Yeah, we are educating them on, obviously using the e-swabs, bringing more e-swabs, asking if they want us to, print any more education for them. We print out the list every single time we have a PPS survey, making sure we have a checklist of who is saying yes to doing the swabs and who is saying no. So we have a, clear documentation, making sure that we're, having bidirectional tracing of putting the actual orders in on our side, making sure that all the ID docs who are initially asking for these swabs are well aware as well. So just make sure that line of communication is kind of just open, and just educating them as well. It's kind of just, the level of, multiple drug resistant organisms is something we're all kind of running into. They're not too unaware of that situation, but it's more just us having that communication of okay, this is where we're coming from. This is why we're doing this.
Buy-in from ID docs is so important, because if there's a disconnect there, it's really challenging to really right-size the scale and importance of doing something like this. You mentioned PPE fatigue. I think patients have also undergone some kind of spooky new disease fatigue in the last 5 to 7 years. For some reason, something happened that, it impacted global public health. But I've noticed when you go into a patient room, and whether it's you doing the swabbing or the nurse doing the swabbing, patients get a little bit hesitant when it comes to having a test. And it can be a challenge to communicate that without scaring them. And then also not go in too much detail about, this is a point prevalence testing that we're doing to see A, B, and C. So what advice would you give to IPs who maybe are wanting to implement something like this, and how to educate the patients?
Ooh, that's a really nice question. I feel like approaching this as an IP to make sure that there is, clarity, honest, open, and transparency with patients as well as staff is just giving a clear understanding of the importance of maintaining possibility of, widespread infections.
Did you provide any scripting or anything for the nurses for when they would go in and swab the patients, or did you guys develop it together? I can just see some patients that are more coherent than others saying, well, why are you swabbing me for this? And do I have something? Or did you guys give me something? And even if you say, well, it's because you came from long-term care, then they would suddenly think that place has something. So how do you guide people on those conversations? Absolutely.
Another great question. I think we guide these situations by making sure that, to my knowledge, I feel like what you guys said with this ghostly, spooky new bug that everybody's kind of just so eerie and kind of just thinking about what's going to be the next thing that's going to just stop and halt everything at once. I think being able to understand the wherewithal that a lot of patients are going through, a lot of bandwidth in these, certain situations where it's just you don't want to build unnecessary stress amongst them. So just let them know that this is the safety precautions we want to take, because we care about them, not only just for the fact of surveillance, but from the fact of, patient safety when it comes to infection prevention. And that's the biggest thing when it comes to infection prevention in my eyes, because patient safety is, one of the biggest things that we have to put, first and foremost amongst all assets in hospitals. if we're able to, communicate that more than anything, that this is something not to only just help us understand if there's a bug here, is help them understand that we want to help them for patient safety.
I think that's really important because patients, as much information as we can give patients to let them know we care. IPs serve as an advocate for patient safety. And it sounds like you guys really embodied that as part of the culture for this initiative. Now, on the long-term care facilities that you guys isolated preemptively from, was that all long-term care facilities in your area, or were there criteria that had to be met for patients from those facilities to be isolated?
They were long-term care facilities that were deemed to be SNFs. So if there's special nursing facilities, some long-term care facilities fall under that criteria. Sometimes if we get too much in a gray area, if we're not able to see if it's going to be a SNF, quote unquote, long-term care facility at the same time, then we just going to just try to get a swab. Because if the patient does, if they're already getting a bunch of blood cultures, if they're already getting, decolonization from MRSA, if they're already getting, certain labs on a normal basis, obviously we don't want to throw more things in this fire that might possibly grow, but it's more of a sense of like understanding, okay, can we have a process of elimination and make sure that this is not one of those things?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense because that's a patient population that's in and out of different hospitals geographically quite a bit. And so it makes sense where if you have something cropping up in one hospital and we go into that SNF and then come out at another hospital a few weeks later, the risk of transmission to a unit is much higher in that case. Now, as part of this implementation, how did you guys interact? We met with a great group from EVS on our last podcast episode and how to tackle challenging areas. So what was that interaction like on your end for the EVS teams?
Yeah, definitely. And EVS, is an amazing department that, infection prevention, infection control has to, meld in as being, one and one, because obviously they're doing a lot of grunt work with cleaning. Side note, cleaning a lot of these rooms that might have remnants of possible C. diff or remnants of possible MRSA, remnants of, doing deep terminal cleans for certain rooms of patients. So I think the biggest thing that we're making sure our EVS staff is well aware of is, if their staff is going into these rooms knowing that there is a PPS survey going on, as well as, you guys know, sometimes there might be patients that are here for, long periods of time that may have just, an ongoing MDRO, and that EVS staff has to come in and clean there regardless. So just like having a lot of empathy and understanding and being able to communicate, their, timeless worth when it comes to being such a backbone of the hospitals is something we want to always value within our EVS staff. And we've been, from my experience while working through the PPS testing, is kind of just making sure that our EVS staff is well aware of the rooms that are going under the survey, as well as having a clear understanding of making sure that their safety is taken into account always.
Now, were you using a different disinfectant for these rooms, or did you use one that already covered Candida auris for your cleaning?
It's still the same, to my knowledge. It is still the same cleaning process they're maintaining. If need be, there might be terminal cleans being done to a person that may be there for a long period of time, and then that patient will be moved to a different room. That's some policies that have been implemented on some of the bigger banners, that if there is a possible patient who has tested positive for Candida auris and they've been there, I want to say between 15 to 20 days, we want to make sure that we're moving that patient from said room, cleaning that room, and then doing the same thing over again if need be, if the patient is still admitted in the hospital.
I'm glad you brought that up too, because sometimes there's a rush to think new germ, I need a new disinfectant, without doing the homework of what does my current disinfectant and cleaning products already cover? Because you may be kind of surprised at what it already covers and what the kill claims are. And so it may not always be necessary, if you're having a Candida auris issue, to switch disinfectants and cleaning supplies. We got to do the homework first. Now, Blake, you talked about the policy piece as well, and it sounds like that was a big part of this Victory Lap being sustainable. So what steps did you guys have to take on the policy front to make this a sustainable program?
Absolutely. So like with our policies, obviously standard transmission based precautions is something that we live by within our hospitals, within every infection prevention, infection control department, I feel like. But with this policy that we're kind of referring to when it comes to the PPS testing, it's laid out amongst the criteria added on to our standard transmission-based precautions. So it's just if a patient is not on isolation within 72 hours of admit that has been ruled out for being a possible Candida auris, we make sure that we are putting them on isolation and then referring them to a PPS testing, as well as, like we said earlier, about the long-term sniff possibilities of doing that test as well. All these things are laid out, making sure that the proper bodies within the hospital are notified when doing the PPS surveillance testing. So understanding that that is laid out clearly in policy. So once we do want to maintain and move forward with these PPS surveillance testing throughout different pods, different floors, we can refer to a structural format that we can follow at all times to make sure that when we're doing these PPS surveillance testing, that it all has, a standardization of whether negative or positive, we're still maintaining the same testing based upon the policy we have laid out.
It makes a sustainable practice to have those things written out and very well defined, can't change from month to month. And I wanted to ask about one outcome from this process, and that's patients that get to be removed from isolation. What was the response like? Because sometimes patients are just kind of stuck in isolation, and it's always a kind of a gripe on my end because it's undeniable that patients may get a lower quality of care when somebody has to put PPE on every time they go into the room. You might, and this is just human nature, you may ignore a call light, you might try to bundle your tasks if a patient is in isolation. Or you may skip that isolation and then it becomes a risk to the staff member. So I always love it when we can get patients out of isolation after a good confirmatory test. So did you see that outcome play out where patients were kind of relieved or nursing was relieved that somebody got to come out of isolation?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as we all know, PPE, use sometimes isn't the best use or isn't done a lot when it comes to a lot of the staff on certain floors, because every nurse is different. Every IP is different. So taking off isolation precautions when it comes to certain patients is, a load off somebody's shoulders, understanding that, only having to wear said PPE for said room, but understanding that patient is no longer ruled out for said possible infectious disease, whatever the case may be. So obviously we make sure, for us here at Banner, or obviously in a lot of different facilities, making sure that we're doing first and foremost, going through these charts and understanding, okay, how can we make sure we can take off these isolations? Because our job, I feel like, which is really important, is understanding the fact, okay, we have to do best case scenario, not only for safety to put a person on precaution, but making sure the criteria is met properly to take them off precaution once an antibiotic is finished. If there's, problematic symptoms have gotten better over time periods, or there has been a clear indication that is something else versus an infectious disease. So doing all that and taking those isolations off is just something that, not only that I feel like the frontline staff is really, excited about, but as well as a small win that each of us infection prevention, infection control specialists are able to see every time we get to do it. So I take pride in that.
I think that's a very underrated task that IPs do every day. That's kind of the first thing that we do. We do it every day, but it does take a lot of work and sometimes a lot of reviewing of charts. But you're right. When you can take somebody off of isolation, when you can kind of get them away from having PPE always in their room, you do feel happy for them. I do feel like it is undervalued, that piece of what we do. And I don't think that a lot of other people understand just how much we put into that.
Blake, as we wrap up this episode, and we just want to thank you for the insights and experience, because this is really a rubber meets the road. How do I go from we identify this need to it's a fully rolled out program at the system? For IPs listening to this, what are some things you would recommend they go and do if they wanted to replicate this process?
I would recommend making sure that all the policies that you have in place at your current infection prevention department are properly updated. Make sure it's all being able to be referred back to CDC regulations, able to understand exactly what the patient population you are dealing with. I feel like it's really important as well, because I feel like different settings, as we all know, can, assess different organisms. It can assess different, problems. The risk assessment at one hospital can be different from a different risk assessment at a different hospital. based upon what you guys are having day in and day out. So I think making sure that each IP is well aware of their surroundings when it comes to what their hospital is trying to prevent, as well as understanding that clear communication with the health departments, being able to have a clear collaborative effort amongst your lab, amongst your CMO and CNO is really important, because having experienced situations in hospitals where a CMO and CNO does not completely buy into the fact of what infection prevention is can create a very kind of underrepresented part of the hospital if they do not completely understand the mission that infection prevention does. So just making sure that you're able to communicate that, as well as have a well-rounded understanding of the importance of what a point prevalence survey really is.
That's excellent. Thank you for that insight and the words of advice too, because this Candida auris is not going away anytime soon. And we get to learn from a great example and a great health system that's being championed to get this process underway. So thank you very much, Blake, for sharing all this and for keeping patients safe out there. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Blake.
Thank you guys so much.
I absolutely loved that discussion with Blake. I really actually had so much fun talking about all of this surveillance testing. I thought that their way of doing point prevalence survey testing was just really cool. And the way that they thought out every step and in all the education, the isolation, who they were going to be testing. I really think Banner Health did such an outstanding job with this process. And I'm so glad that we had Blake on here to share this story with us. And I really hope our listeners can take this and replicate it in their own facilities.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree. It was a victory lap from a frontline perspective, where he knew the education, he knew the need, he knew the criteria that they were using, and also that patient and nursing education piece I thought was really important. We hit on one of my favorite topics, which is getting people out of isolation. So total win of an episode. And very grateful to have Blake on as our victory lap expert. So remember, continue to follow Transmission Control. We've got a great season of guests lined up, because infection stops where information starts.
Thanks for tuning in to the Transmission Control Podcast, where infection stops because information starts. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know. Connect with us on LinkedIn, Facebook, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating and share this episode with your team. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and keep transmission under control.